All right, time for us to go behind the headlines. We're taking a look at the 5 nanogram per se DUID bill that has just passed unanimously a House committee in Colorado. And, of course, the 5 nanogram per se standard is something that got debated quite a bit in the passage of Washington's I-502, just north of us. And this is a very, very difficult issue. As we look at the science, we find that there's just no reliable way to detect whether someone's too impaired to drive based on one fixed number. It's just not going to work. There's a recent Como News, or was it Cairo? One of the news channels up in Washington State. Now, it wasn't a scientific test by any means, but they had 3 different pot smokers, a frequent pot smoker, an occasional pot smoker, and a rare pot smoker, I guess, infrequent, we could say. All taking these tests, the frequent pot smoker showing up at 3 times that 5 nanogram legal limit. She was at 16 nanograms per milliliter. Drove the driving test just fine. The instructor on scene, the cop on scene, all agreed there was nothing wrong with her driving. There would be no reason whatsoever to pull her over. But if she had been pulled over, if she'd had a broken tail light, if she had a headlight out on, or the license plate illumination light out and gotten pulled over, who knows how that stop could have ended up, and she might have been charged for being impaired when her impairment was nothing. We also look at the various studies, and what a lot of the debate on this, I think, hinges on is the fact that we're trying to determine whether or not someone's impaired behind the wheel based on their body chemistry. And I've been a long time advocate of the idea that the politics behind this are different than the science behind this. The science behind this, as we all know, is completely, well, not completely, but there's a lot of junk to it, right? We've shown that people can have very high tolerances. They can operate a vehicle just fine after the use of marijuana, and especially if they have frequent use of marijuana, if they're a patient or a frequent recreational user, they develop that tolerance. We also see on a bottle of Marinol, the Schedule 3 synthetic THC, a warning that says, until you know how this drug may affect you, do not drive or operate heavy machinery, which implies that once you do know how it does affect you, once you're able to handle your your Marinol high, then you're just fine to drive. It's up to your judgment. So trying to set some sort of number in a scientific manner to determine whether someone is impaired is completely ridiculous. There's just no basis for it. However, I believe the politics behind this have nothing to do with the science behind this. The politics behind this are that people want to ensure that others aren't being irresponsible about their drug use. This is partially why we got the BAC standard for alcohol, is we wanted to make sure that if someone was just out recently pounding a bunch of beers, that we would be able to do something about that, to detect them, to stop them, to punish them for being irresponsible about their use. And while blood alcohol is a different situation scientifically, in that the alcohol content of your blood is a pretty reliable indicator of your impairment, I still think the politics behind that had less to do with the impairment and more to do with the responsibility issue. I think really that's what our opponents, and I shouldn't say opponents, that's what I think the general public is looking for. They're looking for something that says we as the cannabis community are also interested in and concerned about making sure people are being responsible about their marijuana use. That people who are going out to drive aren't getting super baked before they do it and becoming a threat behind the wheel, or even worse, smoking while they're driving and being a threat behind the wheel. So I ask the cannabis community to consider that, politically speaking, we may be past the point where it's possible to fight outright a per se DUID. Just as there's an inevitable tide of legalization that is washing over this country, there may also be an inevitable tide that comes with it, an undertow, if you will, of the per se DUID idea. So perhaps we ought to use some jujitsu on this. Perhaps we ought to use the force of that undertow to our benefit. And that is to start arguing for not an impairment standard, but for a recent use standard. When a person uses cannabis, after inhaling cannabis, there is a spike in that nanograms per milliliter. It spikes up into near 100. And that fades within about 5 minutes. If we were to be arguing for a higher per se nanogram limit, say something in the 30 range or the 50 range, something where we could argue, look, we're all concerned about catching people who've just recently smoked, but this 5 nanogram you're setting is catching people who were asleep for 12 hours who smoked the day before. So it's not serving anyone's purposes. Let's argue for something higher that might be more indicative of someone who recently smoked. Now, that alone would not be enough. But I think if we included with it this rebuttable presumption that someone above this 35 or above this 50 limit or whatever it is presumed to be impaired, however, can provide a defense in court, can show, if they can show in court that they weren't impaired, be able to rebut that, perhaps we've got a winning political argument. Perhaps we've got a way that we can show, we can be seen to be compromising without really compromising too much in the effect of protecting those of us who are actually behaving responsibly about this. It's something to consider. And also, I've also mentioned the old smoldering joint rule, like an open container rule, right? No roaches in the ashtray, no used paraphernalia within the driver's section, no accessible marijuana, keep it all in the trunk, keep it locked up, whatever. If we show the community that we are willing to be responsible about this and that we're looking for creative out of the box ways to ensure everybody's safety and responsibility in this new post-legalization era, I think we could go a long way. But I think if we continue to fight absolutely no per se DUID, we'll be seen to be obstructionist and we'll be seen to be selfish and reckless in our pursuit of legalization. I don't have all the answers, but it is something to consider and try to separate the science from the politics of this, because I really do believe that's two separate issues. All right, so there's something to chew on. Think about that, and we're going to